There's a leopard in the mountains of northern India who spent 18 months doing something that no wildlife biologist had ever documented before. Not hunting, not mating, not marking territory, waiting. And the story of what he was waiting for and what he did when the waiting was finally over is one of those things that forces you to sit very quietly for a while after you hear it, because it says something about the nature of animal minds that most of us are not fully prepared to accept. Subscribe right now if you want the real story, not the sanitized version, not the version with the sharp edges filed off, but the full account of what this animal did and what it means and why it changes the way you look at every living thing you will ever encounter in the wild. Let us get into it. The valley where this story begins is called the Ramganga Valley, and it sits inside Corbett Tiger Reserve in the state of Uttarakhand in northern India, in the lower foothills of the Himalayas, where the land transitions from flat agricultural plains into the first steep ridges of the great mountain system that defines the northern edge of the subcontinent. Jim Corbett, the legendary hunter turned conservationist whose name the reserve carries, described this landscape as the most beautiful in all of India, which is a significant claim from a man who spent decades traveling through some of the most spectacular country on the planet. He was not wrong. The Ramganga River runs through the valley in a series of curves that catch the light in the morning and the evening in ways that seem almost designed to be beautiful. The forest on both sides of the river is dense and layered, sal trees dominant in the lower elevations giving way to mixed broadleaf forest as the ridges climb, and everywhere in that forest, if you know where to look and when to look and how to be still enough that the forest forgets you are there are leopards. Corbett Tiger Reserve is one of the best places in the world to see a wild tiger, and so it attracts enormous attention for its tigers as it should. But it is also one of the densest leopard habitats in Asia, and the leopards there have been studied intensively enough that individual animals are known by name, by territory, by history, by the particular patterns of their rosettes, which are as individually unique as a human fingerprint. It is this depth of individual knowledge, built up over years of patient observation by researchers and field guides who have spent more time in that forest than they have spent in any human settlement, that made it possible to understand what one particular leopard did over the course of 18 months. Without the years of baseline knowledge, what happened would have been invisible. Just a leopard moving through a forest, nothing more, but with that baseline it was unmistakably something else entirely. The male leopard who is at the center of this story was known to researchers as Broken Tail, a name that refers to a slight kink in his tail, probably the result of an old injury, a distinctive physical feature that made him immediately identifiable in camera trap images and in direct sightings. He was, at the time our story begins, approximately 7 years old, which for a wild leopard in good habitat means he was in his prime. He had been the dominant male in his territory for at least 3 years. He was large for a leopard, well-fed, scarless except for the tail, which suggests he was not getting into the kind of territorial fights that leave lasting damage. He was, in the language of wildlife biology, a successful individual. His mate was a female known to researchers as the Ramganga female, named for the stretch of river that formed the core of her territory. She was approximately 5 years old. She had raised 2 previous litters of cubs successfully, which in leopard terms is a significant achievement, because infant mortality among leopard cubs is extraordinarily high. Predation, starvation when prey is scarce, the killing of cubs by male leopards seeking to bring females back into estrus, all of these pressures mean that a female who raises 2 litters to independence is doing something that many female leopards never manage. She was experienced, capable, established. The territories of Broken Tail and the Ramganga female overlapped substantially, which is the typical arrangement in leopard society. Leopards are generally solitary animals, but the relationship between a resident male and the females within his territory is not purely transactional. There is evidence from Corbett and from other well-studied populations that adult leopards who know each other over years develop something that behaves like familiarity, like a kind of recognition that goes beyond the basic reproductive calculus. They tolerate proximity that they would not tolerate from a stranger. They use the same resting sites in sequence without conflict. In at least some cases, males have been documented bringing kills to females with cubs, a behavior that goes beyond what pure genetic selfishness would predict and suggests something that, if we saw it in a human context, we would call consideration. Broken Tail and the Ramganga female had been associated for at least 3 years before the events we are describing. They had produced at least 1 litter together that researchers were aware of. They moved through the same landscape in the way that 2 people might move through a shared home, not always together but in constant awareness of each other, tracking each other through scent and sound, and the particular knowledge that comes from long familiarity with another animal's patterns. The night that changed everything happened in the second week of March, near the end of the dry season when the forest floor was crisp with fallen leaves, and the river was lower than it would be after the monsoon, and the animals of the valley were concentrated around the water sources that remained. The Ramganga female had been resting on a large flat rock above the river, a spot she used regularly, a place where the angle of the rock gave a long sightline down the riverbank and the overhanging trees provided shade through the heat of the day. It was a good spot. It was a spot she had used hundreds of times. The threat came from below. A large male tiger, a young animal 3 or perhaps 4 years old, still in the process of establishing his territory and therefore moving through ranges where his presence was not yet settled, had come down to the river to drink and had moved along the bank in the darkness in the direction of the rock where the Ramganga female was resting. Whether he scented her first or saw her first is not known. What the camera trap footage from 2 separate cameras positioned in that section of the valley recorded is what happened next. The female leopard became aware of the tiger at approximately the same moment that the tiger became aware of her. She was on the rock. He was below and to her left, less than 20 meters away. The gap in size between an adult female leopard and a young adult male tiger is substantial. She weighed perhaps 50 kilograms. He weighed somewhere between 160 and 180 kilograms, more than 3 times her weight. In a direct confrontation, there was no version of the outcome that favored her. What she did was what leopards do when they encounter tigers in the dark. She bolted. She came off the rock fast and she ran for the nearest large tree, which was about 40 meters from the rock in the direction of the ridge. She nearly made it. The tiger, young and fast and not yet carrying the weight that older tigers accumulate, closed the distance faster than she had calculated. He caught her before she reached the tree. The camera trap footage does not show everything that happened in the next 4 minutes because the angle is wrong and the light is poor and some of the events occur outside the frame. But it shows enough. It shows the struggle. It shows the outcome. It shows the tiger moving away from the scene after 4 minutes, moving calmly, not running in the direction of the river. It shows the rock, empty and still, the flat surface where the Ramganga female had been resting an hour before, now with nothing on it but the shadows of the trees. Broken Tail was not present during this event. Camera trap data places him on the opposite side of his territory, more than 4 kilometers away, on a ridge above a dry nullah where he had made a kill the previous day and was still resting near the carcass. He was alive and safe and entirely unaware, in the way that animals always are, of what had just happened to the female he had spent 3 years of his life in association with. He would find out in the way leopards find out about everything that happens in their territory, through scent. Through the language of chemical signals that leopards leave on every surface they touch, every rock they rest on, every tree they rub against, every place they mark, a continuous autobiography written in pheromones and glandular secretions and the microscopic information carried in every scent mark. The forest was full of the Ramganga female's presence, her path to the rock, her resting spot, the places she had marked over days and weeks and years. All of it was still there, broadcasting, communicating to every leopard nose in the territory. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The trail simply ended at a point near the flat rock above the river and did not continue. Broken Tail arrived at the area near the flat rock approximately 9 hours after the event, based on camera trap timestamps. What the camera recorded is both straightforward and deeply unsettling to watch. He arrived from the direction of the ridge, following the female's scent trail in the systematic, unhurried way that leopards follow trails of interest. He followed it to the point where it became confused and heavy with other information: the scent of the tiger, the chemical records of the struggle, the particular signals that a dead animal leaves behind, which are different and immediately recognizable to any predator knows. He stopped. He spent a very long time, nearly 12 minutes by the camera trap timestamp, standing in one place, nose to the ground and to the air, processing what had happened here. Then he climbed the flat rock and lay down on it. He lay on the rock for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He did not sleep. His ears moved continuously. His head turned at intervals to look in different directions. He was, in the assessment of every researcher who has reviewed this footage, an animal processing something. And then he got up, descended from the rock, and began doing something that was, in the records of leopard behavior in Corbett Reserve, completely unprecedented. He began following the tiger. Not the tiger's general direction, not the tiger's territory. He began following the specific scent trail of the specific tiger who had killed the Ramganga female, moving through the forest in the methodical, nose-to-ground way that cats follow interesting trails, tracking the animal through the night and into the following day. He did not catch up to the tiger that day. The tiger had a 9-hour head start and had moved a considerable distance during that time. Broken Tail followed the trail to where it faded and then stopped. He spent 2 days in the area where the trail became uncertain, hunting normally, eating, behaving in every other respect like a leopard going about its ordinary business. And then he returned to the area near the flat rock. This is where the 18 months begin. What followed is something that requires careful description, because it is easy to impose a narrative on animal behavior that the behavior does not actually support, and it is equally easy to deny a narrative that the evidence genuinely does support. The researchers who documented this case, who have published on it and debated it extensively in the literature of animal cognition and behavioral ecology, are careful to say that they do not know what was happening inside Broken Tail's mind. They cannot know. But they can describe what he did precisely and in detail, and what he did is something that demands explanation. Over the 18 months that followed the death of the Ramganga female, Broken Tail's behavior changed in several measurable ways. His territory use shifted. He had always been a male who moved regularly through the full extent of his range, which covered approximately 60 square kilometers of the valley and the surrounding ridges. After the death of the Ramganga female, he began spending disproportionate amounts of time in the area of the valley that was closest to the territory of the young tiger. Not inside it. Leopards are not suicidal, and a 50-kilogram cat does not choose direct confrontation with a 170-kilogram cat if it can avoid it. But at the boundary, at the edges, more than any territorial rationale would predict. His scent marking behavior changed too. Leopards are prolific scent markers, using scrapes in the earth, sprays of urine, feces deposited in prominent places, gland secretions rubbed onto vegetation, to continuously broadcast their presence and identity across their territory. Broken Tail's scent marking in the period after the Ramganga female's death became, in the measured assessment of the researchers who were monitoring it, significantly more intense in the direction of the tiger's range and significantly less intense in other parts of his territory. He was, functionally, increasing his presence at one particular boundary. And he was watching. Camera traps documented this repeatedly. Broken Tail positioned at vantage points overlooking the areas where the tiger moved, not moving, not hunting, not doing anything that a leopard needs to do to survive. Just watching, just present, hours at a time on ridges and rocks that gave him a view of the valley below, the valley where the tiger spent most of his time. Wildlife researchers have a term for this kind of sustained observation that cannot be explained by immediate survival or reproductive needs. They call it monitoring. It is documented in a number of intelligent social species, in elephants who return to the bones of dead family members, in chimpanzees who maintain awareness of the movements of rival males over long time periods, in wolves who track the territories of neighboring packs with a precision that goes beyond what simple territorial defense would require. It is behavior that implies memory, that implies anticipation. That implies at some level that we should be honest about even as we are careful about it, something that is organized around a particular outcome. Broken Tail was monitoring the tiger. He was tracking his movements, learning his patterns, building over 18 months a detailed map of where the tiger was and when and how he moved through the valley. He was doing what any effective predator does before an important hunt. He was doing reconnaissance. The tiger, meanwhile, was doing what young tigers do. He was establishing himself. He was making kills. He was slowly consolidating a territory of his own, which brought him into conflict with the older resident male tigers in the area and required constant navigation of the complex social landscape of a tiger population in a reserve where territory was limited and competition was intense. He was not, as far as any camera trap or field observation could determine, aware that he was being watched. Young tigers have a confidence in their own dominance that can look from the outside remarkably like complacency. He was the largest predator in the valley. Nothing in his experience had given him reason to think carefully about leopards. That was the mistake. The encounter happened in the 9th month after Broken Tail began his surveillance, and then, after an inconclusive first engagement, happened again and more decisively in the 18th month. The first encounter warrants its own description, because it illustrates something important about how Broken Tail had been thinking about this problem, because there is no other word for it. He had been thinking. The tiger had a pattern. Over the months of Broken Tail's observation, a very clear pattern had emerged in the tiger's behavior. He drank from the Ramganga River at approximately the same 4 or 5 locations consistently. Tigers, like all big cats, are creatures of habit in ways that experienced hunters and poachers have exploited for centuries. When a tiger finds a good drinking spot, a place where the bank gives easy access to the water and the approach is comfortable and there is no strong association of danger, he returns to it repeatedly. The young tiger had several such spots along his stretch of the river. And one of those spots was in a narrow section of the valley where the river bent sharply and the bank on one side rose steeply into a rocky face. And on the other side, the forest came right to the water's edge with a large fallen sal tree creating a natural screen perhaps 8 meters from the waterline. This is where Broken Tail waited on the night of the 9th month, not rushing the tiger, not attacking from a distance. Waiting, pressed flat against the fallen tree in the absolute stillness that leopards can achieve, a stillness so complete that they effectively disappear even in open habitat, the rosette pattern of their coat breaking up their outline until your eye simply slides past them. He waited there by the field guide's best estimate based on the camera trap data for more than 4 hours before the tiger arrived. What happened next was fast and, in the terms of a pure physical confrontation between a 50-kilogram cat and a 170-kilogram cat, could really only end one way. But it did not end the way you would predict from the weight numbers alone. It did not end in either animal's death, not that night. It ended with something considerably more interesting. Broken Tail launched from the fallen tree when the tiger's head was down to the water. He landed on the tiger's back in the precise spot, between the shoulder blades and behind the neck, where a big cat can do maximum damage to prey or to a rival, where the leverage is best and the vital structures are most accessible. The tiger's reaction, explosive and immediate, threw him off within seconds. But in those seconds, Broken Tail's claws had done their work, raking 4 deep parallel lines across the tiger's left shoulder, drawing blood, leaving wounds that were not life-threatening but were significant. Wounds that an animal that size carries for weeks. More importantly, Broken Tail escaped. He was off the tiger and up a tree so quickly that the camera trap barely captured his movement, a blur going up and then a leopard in the upper canopy, 15 meters up, looking down at a furious, bleeding, confused tiger circling the base of the tree. The tiger could not follow. Tigers are not the climbers leopards are. He was not getting up that tree. He circled for 20 minutes, roaring, the sound carrying through the valley and triggering every other animal in earshot into alarm. Then he left. Broken Tail stayed in the tree for another 2 hours. Then he descended, moved quietly through the dark forest and disappeared into the ridges above the valley. This is the moment that the researchers who study this case argue is the most significant, because Broken Tail had succeeded, in the clearest possible terms, in doing something that no individual leopard has been documented doing before. He had successfully attacked and injured a tiger roughly 3.5 times his own weight, from ambush, using the specific location and timing knowledge he had accumulated over 9 months of careful surveillance, and he had escaped without serious injury. He had, in the plainest possible language, gotten away with it. But he was not finished. The 9 months that followed the first ambush are in some ways the most fascinating part of this entire story, because Broken Tail did not repeat the attack immediately. He did not find the tiger again in the next week or the next month and try again. What the camera trap data shows is that after the first ambush, Broken Tail pulled back from the boundary of the tiger's territory significantly. He spent more time in the core of his own range. His behavior for several months looked very much like the behavior of a leopard settling back into normal patterns, hunting somber and spotted deer and the smaller prey that is a leopard's everyday diet, resting, moving through his territory, marking, living an ordinary leopard life. And then, in the 14th month after the Ramganga female's death, the monitoring resumed. This is the part that the researchers find most difficult to explain in conventional terms. The return to focused surveillance after a 9-month gap, because it implies that the motivation driving the behavior was not something acute, not a response to an immediate trigger but something durable, something that persisted through months of apparently normal behavior and then reasserted itself, something that Broken Tail was, in some functional sense of the word, carrying. The second phase of surveillance was shorter, 4 months compared to the 9 months of the first phase, and the behavioral signature was different in one important way. This time, Broken Tail was not just watching, he was practicing. There's a section of the valley where the terrain rises sharply on both sides into rocky outcrops, a natural amphitheater in miniature where the acoustics are strange and the sight lines are limited, a place where the forest is denser and the light is always lower than the surrounding area. Broken Tail began using this area intensively in the 16th and 17th months. Camera traps caught him there at all hours, not resting, not hunting, but doing something that looks unmistakably like rehearsal. Moving through the narrow passages between the rocks at speed, jumping between boulders, pressing himself flat and then launching upward and forward in the explosive burst that a leopard uses for a surprise attack. These were not the normal movements of a leopard going about its day. They were too focused, too repetitive, too specifically structured around a particular physical action. The researchers who reviewed this footage described what they were seeing carefully and with appropriate scientific caution. They said it appeared consistent with an animal optimizing a physical skill for a specific application. They said they could not rule out that this was simply normal leopard activity that had been misread due to observer expectation. But they also said that in the combined records of Corbett Tiger Reserve, spanning decades of camera trap operation and field observation, they had never seen a leopard using this particular area in this particular way, and that the temporal association with the history of events preceding it was, in their judgment, difficult to explain as coincidence. Something was building towards something. Month 18, the dry season again as it had been when the Ramganga female died. The river lower, the animals concentrated, the forest floor dry and loud underfoot in the way that changes the movement patterns of everything that lives there, the prey animals more cautious, the predators more deliberate. The tiger had continued his patterns through the preceding months. He was now fully established in his territory, heavier, more confident, a year and a half older than he had been on the night at the flat rock. The wounds from the first ambush had healed cleanly, leaving faint scars on his left shoulder that the camera traps could just barely resolve. Whether he remembered what had caused them is something we genuinely cannot know. What we can say is that his behavior showed no particular wariness around the area of the first ambush. He was back to drinking from his regular spots along the river, including the narrow bend with the fallen sal tree. He should not have gone back there. That is what the researchers say with a kind of retrospective certainty that is easier to feel after you know how things ended. He had been attacked at that spot once. A more cautious animal might have revised its patterns, but the young tiger had won that confrontation in the sense that the smaller animal had fled, and animals that win confrontations tend to not update their threat assessment from them. He was the biggest thing in the valley. The bite of a leopard was not, in his lived experience, a serious threat. He went back to drinking where he liked to drink. Broken Tail was already there. The second ambush was documented by 3 camera traps at different angles. The researchers have this one much better than the first. The tiger comes to the water at 22 minutes past 11 at night in October in the 18th month after the Ramganga female's death. He approaches the river in his normal way, moving slowly head low, his body relaxed in the particular way of a large predator that has no current concerns. He reaches the bank. He begins to lower his head toward the water. Broken Tail comes from above. Not from the fallen sal tree this time. From the rocky face above the bank on the opposite side, 10 meters up, a position that the researchers believe he reached at some point in the preceding hours, a position that required him to climb a nearly vertical face of rock and then wait in absolute stillness at a height and angle that was completely different from the first attack. He had changed his approach. He had not repeated the same ambush from the same position. He had thought about it differently this time, found a different angle, a higher position, one that gave him not just the element of surprise but a downward trajectory that maximized the force of impact. He hits the tiger behind the left ear on the neck, and the force of the impact from 10 meters above and behind drives the tiger's head down and forward. What happens in the next 45 seconds is difficult to describe without sounding like something from a film, except that it is real and it was filmed, or at least captured by the flat, unblinking eye of 3 camera traps that had no stake in how it ended. Broken Tail is on the tiger's neck. His hind legs are raking at the tiger's spine. His front claws are locked into the hide behind the tiger's jaw. The tiger is rolling, trying to get purchase on the rocky bank. Trying to throw the leopard off as it did the first time, but the angle is wrong this time, the ground is wrong. The weight of the leopard coming from above rather than from the side has disrupted the tiger's ability to simply surge upright and throw his attacker clear. It lasts 45 seconds, and then the tiger is still. Not dead, that needs to be said clearly. The tiger was not killed. He was alive when Broken Tail released him and moved away, alive when the camera traps captured him lying on the bank for the next 20 minutes before slowly, heavily, rising to his feet and moving away from the river. He would recover over weeks from the injuries of that night. He would never again, according to the camera trap record, visit the narrow bend in the river with the fallen sal tree. He would shift his ranging patterns in the following months in ways that the researchers interpreted as avoidance of the section of the valley most associated with Broken Tail's core territory. He had been beaten by a leopard, beaten decisively and at a location of the leopard's choosing by an animal that had spent 18 months preparing for this specific encounter. He had lost, and he knew it in the way that animals know things, which is to say in the way that matters most, in his body, in his choices, in the behavior modifications that followed. Broken Tail was documented the following morning on the flat rock above the river, the same rock where the Ramganga female had rested on the last night of her life. He spent 4 hours there, lying in the early sun, apparently relaxed, his ears moving with the sounds of the waking forest. Then he got up and walked along the ridge in the direction of the deep forest, and the camera traps followed him for a while and then lost him in the trees. Now is the moment to stop and sit with what this story actually says, because it is easy to rush past the implications in the excitement of the events themselves, and the implications are where the most important things live. What Broken Tail did over 18 months cannot be adequately explained by any of the simple frameworks that we traditionally use to describe animal behavior. It was not a territorial response. He was not defending resources. The tiger had not taken his food or his range in any economically significant sense. It was not a reproductive response in the obvious sense, though the death of a mated female does have reproductive consequences for a male, and so there is a hormonal argument that could be made. But that argument does not explain the specificity of the target, the surveillance, the apparent practice, the changed ambush location. A purely hormonal or reproductive account of this behavior would predict a different pattern. It would predict increased mating behavior, increased conflict with rival males, increased territory marking, not 18 months of focused attention on a single individual. The framework that the researchers who published on this case found most consistent with the evidence is one that, even a decade ago, would have been almost unsayable in a peer-reviewed paper on animal behavior. They describe Broken Tail's behavior as consistent with goal-directed planning toward a specific outcome, informed by episodic memory of a specific past event, and maintained over a time period that requires the kind of sustained motivational state that we in humans would associate with a persistent emotional drive. In plain language, he remembered what the tiger did. He experienced something that functioned like grief or loss, or the particular state that arises when a member of your social world is violently removed from it. And he experienced something that functioned like a desire for a specific outcome, not just to survive, not just to reproduce, to do this particular thing to this particular animal at a time and place of his choosing. The use of the word revenge in describing animal behavior is something that scientists are deeply cautious about, and rightly so. The history of comparative psychology is littered with the consequences of anthropomorphizing animal behavior too aggressively, of projecting human motivational structures onto animals whose inner lives are genuinely different from ours and who deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than as furry versions of us. That caution is real, and it is important. But there is a different kind of mistake available here, a mirror image of anthropomorphism, which is to deny the evidence of complex internal states in animals because acknowledging those states is uncomfortable, because it complicates the clean lines between human and animal experience that we have historically found it convenient to maintain. The researchers who studied Broken Tail are not sensationalists. They are careful, trained, methodologically rigorous people who have spent careers building the kind of baseline knowledge that makes a case like this visible at all. And what they say, carefully and with all appropriate qualifications attached, is that the behavior they observed is most parsimoniously explained by acknowledging that this leopard maintained, over 18 months, a specific motivational state oriented toward a specific outcome involving a specific individual. That is what revenge is. At the functional level, stripped of the cultural and moral overlay that the word carries in human contexts, that is exactly what revenge is. A motivational state that persists beyond the event that triggered it and drives behavior oriented toward a specific outcome involving the specific individual responsible for the triggering event. If a human being did what Broken Tail did, we would have no hesitation in using that word. And this is where the story opens out into something much larger than one leopard in one valley in northern India. Because the question of what is happening inside the minds of animals, of what they remember and what they plan and what they feel and how their inner lives are organized, is one of the most important and most rapidly changing questions in science right now. And it matters not just as an intellectual exercise but as a deeply practical question about how we relate to the other animals who share this planet with us and what obligations we have toward them. The last 30 years of research in animal cognition have produced findings that would have been considered frankly impossible by the mainstream scientific consensus of a century ago. We know now that crows and ravens not only use tools but manufacture them, selecting raw materials and modifying them to specific shapes for specific tasks, demonstrating a level of forward planning that requires holding a future goal state in mind while modifying an object in the present. We know that elephants recognize themselves in mirrors, which is a test of self-awareness that very few species pass. We know that chimpanzees plan for future needs, carrying tools to use sites before they arrive, a behavior that requires mental time travel, the ability to project oneself forward into a future situation and prepare for it now. We know that dolphins use signature whistles as individual names and respond to hearing recordings of the whistles of dead companions differently from the way they respond to the whistles of strangers. We know that animals grieve, Not in a way that looks identical to human grief, because of course it does not, but in ways that are recognizable as grief to anyone who takes the evidence seriously. Elephants return to the bones of dead family members over years and decades. They handle the bones with their trunks, spending more time with the bones of individuals they knew than with the bones of strangers. They show physiological signs of distress at death sites. They stay with dying family members and remain with the body after death in ways that serve no obvious survival function. A female chimp in one famous case carried the mummified body of her dead infant for weeks. The researchers who documented it described her behavior in terms that, if you changed the species label, would read as a clinical description of complicated grief in a human patient. Broken Tail's story fits into this growing body of evidence not as an outlier but as a part of a pattern that science is increasingly having to take seriously. The pattern says, the inner lives of animals are richer, more complex, more emotionally layered, more temporally extended than the behaviorist paradigm that dominated 20th century animal science allowed for. The pattern says, memory and anticipation and social bonds and the disruption of those bonds by loss are not uniquely human experiences. They are mammalian experiences at minimum and probably more broadly distributed across the animal kingdom than that. The Broken Tail's case adds something specific to that pattern that even the extensive literature on animal grief and animal cognition does not quite capture in the same way. It adds duration. It adds strategic sophistication. It adds the changed ambush location, the second approach from above rather than from behind the fallen tree, which implies that Broken Tail had evaluated the outcome of the first attack, identified what had gone wrong, and modified his approach accordingly. That is not just memory of a past event. That is learning from a specific failure and applying that learning to a revised plan. That is problem-solving oriented toward a specific goal over an extended time period. To understand how extraordinary that is, consider what it requires. It requires Broken Tail to remember the first ambush and its outcome, specifically enough to identify what went wrong. It requires him to maintain the goal of the second ambush as a live goal across the months between the two events, even when his behavior appeared on the surface to have returned to normal. It requires him to apply his reasoning about what went wrong to the design of a new approach. It requires him to identify and occupy a new ambush position based on that reasoning. It requires him to wait in that position for hours at 10 meters height on a rocky face until the specific target arrived. All of this is not just animal behavior in the traditional sense. This is something that shares functional architecture with human planning and problem-solving in ways that should give us serious pause about the assumptions embedded in the concept of a sharp boundary between human and animal minds. The implications radiate outward in many directions. They radiate into the way we think about animal welfare, because if animals are capable of sustained emotional states oriented toward specific outcomes, if they're capable of something that functions like grief and something that functions like purpose, then the question of what we owe them in terms of how we treat them looks very different from how it looks if we assume that animal experience is simple and transient, and fundamentally unlike our own. They radiate into the way we think about conservation, because if individual animals in wild populations are not interchangeable units, but individuals with histories and relationships and cognitive lives, then the loss of any individual animal is a different kind of loss from what population-level conservation thinking tends to account for. Broken Tail was not just a leopard. He was a specific leopard with a specific history and a specific set of cognitive capacities that the valley needed him alive and present to demonstrate. They radiate in the most personal way into how you will look at the next wild animal you see. Not the next animal on a screen, but the next one in actual life. The crow on the fence post or the deer at the edge of a field, or if you're very lucky, a leopard on a rock above a river in the Himalayan foothills, lying in the morning sun with its eyes half closed and its ears tracking the sounds of the forest below. Because you will know if you have been paying attention that there is something in there. Something that persists, something that remembers, something that plans and grieves and waits, something that is running a version of an inner life that is not the same as yours but is not nothing, not even close to nothing, not the simple automatic machinery that it was convenient for us to imagine it was back before we started actually looking. The flat rock above the Ramganga River is still there. The narrow bend in the river with the fallen sal tree is still there. The forest is still there, dense and layered and full of the sounds that a forest makes when it is alive. The alarm calls and the birdsong and the wind in the sal trees and the river below, everything, steady and cold and older than any of the stories we tell about the things that live along its banks. Broken Tail's territory is occupied now by another leopard, a younger male who arrived in the valley and claimed the range after Broken Tail himself disappeared from the camera trap record about 2 years after the events we have described, as wild leopards eventually do disappear, into the forest, into time. But the camera trap footage is still there. The data is still there. The published research is still there. And the questions it raises are still there, growing rather than shrinking as science continues to develop more sophisticated tools for looking at what is happening inside animal minds. The field of comparative cognition and animal emotional intelligence is currently one of the most active and most consequential in all of biology, driven by researchers who take seriously the obligation to look at the evidence rather than at their prior assumptions, to follow where the data goes even when it goes somewhere that disrupts comfortable categories. What the data says, in this case and in dozens of related cases from animal populations around the world, is something that many cultures outside the modern Western scientific tradition have known for a very long time. Indigenous communities that have lived alongside large predators for generations have consistently, across cultures and continents, described those animals in terms that attribute to them memory, personality, purpose, grief, and the capacity for something that functions like justice or reciprocity. Those accounts were dismissed for a long time by Western scientific frameworks as anthropomorphism or myth. The dismissal is becoming harder to sustain. The Gond people of central India, who have coexisted with leopards in the forests of the Satpura range for longer than written history records, have a body of oral tradition about leopards that describes them in exactly the terms that Broken Tail's behavior illustrates. They say the leopard is the animal that does not forget, not the elephant, who is the Western cultural symbol of long memory, but the leopard, who is smaller and more hidden and whose memory is more personal. The leopard remembers individuals, the tradition says. The leopard remembers what was done and by whom. And the leopard, unlike the tiger who acts from power and the elephant who acts from grief, acts from something more like calculation. The leopard makes a plan. Sitting with that traditional knowledge, alongside the camera trap data from Corbett Reserve, is one of those experiences that realigns something in your sense of what knowledge is, and where it comes from and how long it takes to accumulate. The researchers with their cameras and their timestamps and their peer-reviewed publications arrived at essentially the same conclusion that the Gond oral tradition had reached through centuries of direct observation and living alongside. The methods were completely different. The conclusion was the same.